Hi, everybody. I'm Dennis Daly. I spent 20 years with United Press International, most of it with the old UPI Radio Network. And my favorite assignment was going on the road producing and hosting American Montage. It was an hour-long weekly program. Now here's an edited version of one of those shows. We're on the road again this week, this time just north of Palm Springs, California. Now, you probably heard of Palm Springs. It's actually about 9 or 10 different communities in a very long strip in what is called the Coachella Valley. It can get hot as the hinges of Hades here in Palm Springs in the summertime, upwards of 120 degrees. But because of the good weather, even in wintertime, it began in the 1920s to be a place the Hollywood stars would come to get away from Los Angeles, because it was just a little warmer out here. One of those Hollywood stars was Gladys Walton, a star of the silent era. I caught up with her son, John Walton, who has an amazing story to tell about his mom and about the fellow he assumes was his father. I mentioned to John that the Roaring Twenties must have really lived up to that description.
It was wild Roaring Twenties like you cannot believe, and I do take them back in my time machine to everything as it was, including Al in the Roaring Twenties. He worked with a mob that handled Detroit, and he made an association with them, and they were known as the Purple Gang. They were the worst fellas going. And as a matter of fact, after the association, rather than trying to take over Detroit, he said, hey, I'll work with you, because there were 7 of them, and they were as mean as they came.
If you can't beat them, join them.
And that's exactly what he did. If you're his customer, he didn't want to hurt you at all. But when it came to the other mobs that were out after him, that was a whole different story. You're after me, I'll do you first. And with the help of the Purple Gang, that's exactly what happened.
It's interesting, this marriage, if you will, between the Chicago and the Detroit mobs.
Yes.
There must have been a lot of traffic going back and forth between Detroit and Chicago through Michigan and South Bend, Indiana. That must have been quite a crime corridor through there.
It was, because what happened, the Purple Gang was the one got the booze from Canada, right over the river.
Right.
And they brought it to him. And then when they wholesaled it to Al, part of the association, he put his own label on it, and it was a log cabin label. It was Al's personal label, log cabin.
So because of Detroit being just across the river from Windsor,
yes,
it was the entry point.
That's it. That's it. That's exactly it. And it was reserved for the Purple Gang, and if you wanted to get booze from Canada over there, you better pay them off as you're bringing it over as a tribute to them, or you could get killed.
Isn't it interesting to think of this all-powerful Al Capone who had to pay tribute to another gang? I mean, this is new information to me.
Well, not really tribute. He just really bought from them as well when he hired them to do his hits. He paid them.
Right. They moved then from becoming his supplier to his henchman in many ways.
In many ways, including the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Capone had met your mother while she was working on a movie, The Untamable?
Yes, in 1922.
When did Capone start coming to Hollywood? And in other words,
that's when he came.
Okay.
That's when he came.
And having enough money, he could visit just about any place he wanted to.
Well, and once again, he came out on the train, beautiful train, and it was luxury traveling out to Hollywood or L.A. on the train. And the train would stop at Garnet train station, which was there, the 10 and Indian Canyon.
And this would have been essentially the Palm Springs train station.
That's right.
In that area. I will tell people who are not from the Palm Springs area that the railroad comes out from Los Angeles, but it doesn't come near Palm Springs. And you have to go about 8 or 9 miles north of town or would have at that time, and that's where the Amtrak station is today. It is way out there.
Well,
we have
yes.
no railroad tracks in the city here in Palm Springs.
Well, it's still there. The railroad tracks are still there
Yes.
at Indian Canyon and the 10. The
Yes.
tracks are still there. But it was easy ride when Al would come to town, or my mother would come out with the movie stars to enjoy the springs and everything else. And it was a weekend.
So Palm Springs as an escape for Hollywood types goes back to the 20s.
Oh, yes. Including Valentino came out here and owned property in Palm Springs and brought his horses out and used to ride his horses after making Son of the Sheik. He rode his horses out here and owned property in Palm Springs.
You know, it's interesting. I'm a non-drinker. You know, I think a lot of non-drinkers have this aggravation against people who drink excessively. I've always thought if I get in a car wreck, it's going to be some drunk driver hitting me.
Well, that's true.
But the fact that the appetite for alcohol is so insatiable, the people who push through Prohibition must have never had a clue as to what Prohibition would create.
It created just the opposite. As a matter of fact, they regretted it once all these do-gooders got it through. Then they says, and it's in history where they said, wait a minute, we created a monster here. We did create a monster, and that was one of the reasons that Prohibition was repealed. And another reason Prohibition was repealed, the government is saying, wait a minute, we're not getting tax money, and we need that tax money because we're broke too. So that was one of the biggest reasons that they repealed Prohibition.
And it fueled the mob.
Oh, yes.
Which got into everything else, from prostitution to numbers. And so it was the fuel behind this huge rise in crime in a lot of different areas.
Oh, yes. What happened after...
And it made the average person a criminal.
Well, let me go on. After Prohibition was over, and now the mobs are looking elsewhere, which is prostitution and numbers and you name it, okay? They're looking elsewhere. Well, what happened, the few remaining members of the Purple Gang helped form another organization that was known as Murder Incorporated.
No.
Yes.
That was the origin of that thing.
Yes.
You are in many ways an historian who has preserved a really important part of our heritage and put it in the proper perspective, and I thank you for that.
Well, can I say this in finality? Capone's Fortress West is my time machine, and it's in the novel, and it's all about my step-grandfather, and he shared all his stories with me also. And the stories of the booze, the Prohibition, and the more violent part of Prohibition. The first story, Gladys Capone, the untold story, is softer. It's about my mother and her relationship in Hollywood with the other stars, and there's some violence in that. But the real facts are in Capone's Fortress West, and that's the facts of my step-grandfather, and it was wild. Once again, my whole family history is what you call completely wild.
John Walton, historian in Palm Springs, California, whose mother was the silent film star Gladys Walton, who convinced Al Capone to build a hideaway out in the middle of the desert. And during the time she and Capone were dating, well, that's about when John Walton was born. So I asked him, do you think Capone was your father? He simply smiled. And there you have it, another edited episode of one of the American Montage programs prepared for the UPI Radio Network back in the 1980s and 90s. I'm Dennis Daly. Thanks for listening. Thanks for going with me this week. And check YouTube for more American Montage programs.